afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Middle East Institute for our talk. Today we are going to listen to Dr. Saba Babawi, who is a journalism and media researcher. She's the author of Media Power and Global Television News, The Role of Al Jazeera English, and her most recent book is Investigative Journalism in the Arab World, Issues and Challenges. Dr. Babawi is also co-editor of Social Media and the Politics of Reportage, the Arab Spring. She holds PhD in International News from the University of Melbourne. She also has an MA Research in Media Policy from the Queensland University of Technology and an MA in Communications from Monash University. Having worked as a journalist since 1995, I think she will bring to today's talk a very interesting perspective, looking at how a culture of Arab investigative journalism can be developed. A few key areas that Dr. Babawi will look at will be the issues and the challenges, the context within which investigative journalism could develop, and looking at how investigative journalism as a tool could be used to develop an environment that allows for public debate. Dr. Babawi, I'm going to give you the floor.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thanks everyone for coming. I've been here for almost a month and it's been a fabulous experience, and I really feel happy to talk to you about a project that is very close to my heart. And if you'd allow me, I'll commence. I'll be probably talking around 40 to 45 minutes, and then I'll try and keep it short so that we can have more of a discussion, which is probably the more fun bit, really. And I hope that it is a topic, I mean, when you talk about the Arab world, and probably not just journalism, but investigative journalism specifically, it's not the most optimistic, uplifting topic. So so bear with me, but I have to lay out the challenges and the issues as they are. So in an article that was published on the 21st of June 2010, the executive director for the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, which is an organization called Arij, and I'll be talking about that a lot during this talk today. The director is called Rana Sabbagh, and she describes in this article that she wrote in 2010 how 3 young Syrian journalists gather in a cafe in Damascus. They're drinking Arabic coffee and talking animatedly. And not in relation to the usual discussions about regional politics, ministerial portfolios and media institutions, but on issues that are actually affecting the lives of the Syrian people and the public, such as an increase in child sexual abuse, public health risks from environmental waste, and medical incinerators failing to meet international standards. So she notes that these journalists who are sitting there in this cafe are not just talking, but they're investigating, and more importantly, they're publishing, which is very important. This picture painted by Sabbagh can be aptly described as beautiful. It not only gives a sense of optimism, but also an impression that change is underway towards addressing issues that are directly impacting the people. These newly trained investigative journalists gathering in a cafe in Damascus have discovered the power they hold for change. Yet, on the 3rd of December 2014, Sabbagh writes another article, and it's entitled Syria, Inside the World's Deadliest Place for Journalists. And she describes how Syria, the same place where those 3 journalists were sitting enthusiastically, talking about the possibilities that their craft could unveil, has become, and I quote, a country that has become a graveyard for journalists. So with that optimistic start, since 2011, as you know, the civil war in Syria has interrupted, has been on the increase, and surprisingly, it came at a time where the investigative journalism was starting to happen in Syria. So it was starting to happen, it hadn't even been established, And this is just reflective of the political landscape of the region and the fact that it's continuously shifting and changing. Development and reform at every level are much needed in the Arab world, but are extremely hard to achieve, especially in countries such as Syria and Yemen. And by the way, Yemen is another country which was developing a very strong investigative journalism culture. I'll talk about that more. Though both these countries that are now conflict zones were showing promising signs for development in investigative journalism, but of course no longer possible due to political conflict and unrest. And despite this, there are still some individual attempts to produce investigative reporting in the midst of conflict, which is very interesting. However, this does not come with a few obstacles and challenges. Before I go on, I might just talk about what investigative journalism is. And I know that you know, but it's important to differentiate it. Although the slide before was talking about how journalism should be investigative regardless, nonetheless, investigative journalism has a few defining aspects that do differentiate it from other forms of journalism. As you can see, first, it's about digging deeper on a particular issue and topic, and it needs to be of public interest. It is a process rather than an event, so it's an ongoing process that involves a lot of research. It needs to be original and proactive, so it needs to shed something that, as it says here, shed new information. It should be multi-sourced, in other words, well-researched from multiple sources, so well-evidenced. And because of its in-depth nature, it usually calls for greater resources financially, teamwork, and time. It's more so than a routine news report. Can you hear me all okay? Great. Ideally, such journalism, as the previous slide from the UNDP report showed, is what journalism should be doing in general. Nonetheless, it's a costly form of journalism. It's a dangerous and a time-consuming form of journalism. And this is a universal problem all over the world, not just in the Arab world. I am from Australia now working, and more investigative units in newspapers are actually closing down. It's just not financially viable. We don't have in Australia philanthropy like the US. So it just is, it's interesting that at a time when in the Western world it's kind of shrinking, in places like the Arab world, they're trying, and this is mainly because of funding, which I'll talk about in a minute. Investigative reporting, however, I'll just need to highlight, is actually not new. When I was writing my book, I found it incredibly hard to find examples of investigative journalism in the Arab world. The history of it has not been written. However, there were individual investigations, not organizational ones, so you would see the eruption of a few individual investigations in the 50s and 60s. One of them is Ihsan Abdel Quddus, who was a prominent investigative writer. He wrote for the publication Rose al-Yusuf, which was founded by his mother, Fatima al-Yusuf. He syndicated columns for the government, newspapers and magazines, and he had a very well-known column called Café on Politics Street, which addressed the current issues at the time in the streets of Egypt. And so in this way, he kind of extended the discourses from the physical public sphere to the mediated public sphere. Another prominent investigative reporter, as you can see on the screen, is Mohammed Hassanin Haikal, who I'm sure you know, an Egyptian journalist who actually took the position of editor-in-chief in the Cairo-based newspaper Al-Ahram, and he focused on developing investigative reporting. What he did is he would take graduates, journalism graduates, train them in the newspaper, and then just produce investigative journalism. But these examples of these individual attempts were not sustained. They were individual attempts, and to be honest with you, they were isolated cases, and there were some factors that did lead to their success. In the case of Nasser, of Hassanin Haikal, he was had close ties with Jamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, and so he had access to information, as you can see from the Cairo documents. So organized and institutionalized investigative journalism in the Arab world just has not been realized. Until 2005, where the establishment of the Arab Reporters for Investigative Journalism, Arij, in Jordan was established. And I need to point out that this was way before the Arab Spring protests. And what happened is it was based on a Danish-Arab partnership and a committee of foreign ministry officials from Denmark, members from the Danish Investigative Association. They came to Jordan. They interviewed 100 journalists from Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And ministry officials from these Arab countries, including to journalists, decided that, yep, it's not a bad idea to have investigative journalism. So they allocated funds through the Danish parliament, and now there are multiple funders, including SIDA, which is the Swedish government organization. Arij started with a pilot in Jordan, then Syria and Lebanon. I'll spare you the details, but it didn't just happen like that. It was quite a hard, in fact, the director of Arij told me that she had to, when she started in Syria, they told her, she met with the Minister of Communication, and he said, yep, you can train investigative journalists, Syrian investigative journalists, don't touch politics. She said, all right. So then, currently, Arij operates in 9 countries. I need to highlight that they're both conflict and non-conflict countries, namely Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, Bahrain, Palestine, Yemen, and Tunisia. So in this lecture this afternoon, I'm going to look at the issues and challenges affecting both. I'll talk about training first, and then I'll talk about practice, just in the hope of better understanding what needs to be addressed in order to foster a culture of investigative Arab journalism. So I'll start with training. So my research is, I went to Jordan, went to Arij, I did observational analysis of training, I talked to journalists, I talked to coaches, and I'll tell you what I found. The first, as I said, institutionalized training of investigative reporters was run by Arij, and Anders Jerko, whose quote you have there, is a board member, and he emphasized that the role of Arij is not just training journalists in investigative journalism skills, but training them in journalism skills. So this is an important aspect, that they realized that they were dealing with journalists who didn't have basic journalism skills, let alone investigative journalism skills. And he says, as this quote says, at Arij, what we see is that investigative journalism should not be different from any other form of journalism. It's synonymous of qualitative journalism, and that's what it is. So Arij runs training in 2 ways. The first way is they do it through workshops and focus on particular themes. So, for example, they choose the theme of elections. The other type takes the form of regular training sessions, which are more the traditional, typical way of training, and they would work with journalists on particular courses, but on stories of their choice. So I'll run you through some of the issues I've found. The first one is sustainability with training. There are many issues that are specific to training of investigative journalism, and Saad Hattar, who's one of the trainers and head of the investigative journalism unit there, says that problem in journalism in the Arab world in general is that there is just no sustainable training. So the way it happens is journalists usually, they would probably have journalism degrees. Then they go to just receive their journalism education by working with editors. And they don't have any formal training. Now, I realize that this is what we probably have in other parts of the world and we call internships, but the problem's a bit more magnified in that the editors who are working there don't have formal training themselves. So this quote I found quite shocking, well, not very shocking, but it stayed with me. He said, "You can be aware that it is not easy to raise and train a new generation of investigative journalists who come from swamps of unprofessional journalism." I'm translating here from Arabic, but it is a very precise translation. "We have a problem in media organizations that we are very backward." He wasn't very optimistic that day. "And there is no sustainable interactive training process." The training that's received by journalists in newsrooms, as I said, is usually in-house and seldom explores and teaches new techniques and styles of reporting. Journalists and their editors, tend to use traditional methods of reporting, but you find in Arab transnational media corporations such as Al Jazeera and Al Arabiya, you can see that these media channels are competing at a regional and global level, so they have incorporated more contemporary news styles of reporting into their newsrooms. But at state level and local newsrooms, the traditional methods of reporting remain unchanged. And there you find that when journalists go, the training of investigative journalism, they learn methods of reporting that to them and to their editors are seen as revolutionary. The same issue remains that many of these trained journalists cannot practice what they've learned. So even if they learn and develop the skills, the issue is they cannot practice what they've learned when they go back to the newsroom and work, because they're working with traditional editors who don't usually give them time or the freedom to practice what they've learned. So this is one of the main issues. It makes it difficult for trained journalists to implement what they've learned through their training. And this is one of the concerns that I've heard while watching journalists train, is if they get it, they say, okay, I got it. Now, how am I going to go and use it? How can I do this back in my newsroom? They come to the realization that it's not possible. Therefore, a main challenge in training Arab investigative journalism is that they return to their newsrooms and work with editors who still operate in traditional frames. It's therefore questionable the extent to which it's sustainable and the degree to which younger journalists can return to their newsroom and instigate change. This could be, however, just a transitional phase, but currently this is the problem. The other issue that I noticed, and it was really incredible to watch in training sessions, and I think is a huge challenge, is the differentiation between opinion and fact. So during the observational analysis of training sessions, there was a constant attempt by coaches to remind journalists the difference between opinion and fact. And when they were brainstorming and workshopping story ideas, training journalists would introduce ideas for stories that were just opinion and emotion based as part of their building block for their investigations. And I'll explain that a little bit more, but I think this is mainly related to the Arab culture of journalism that has historically been based on mobilizing masses and promoting the official message. And this was particularly evident during training sessions when journalists were given the opportunity to report on stories of their choice, which they don't usually get in their newsrooms, and which it always reflected a strong sense of activism. That was the main observation. Now, yes, activism can be a driver behind an investigative story, no doubt. And there was a need during the training session, however, to rework their thinking towards the spirit of truth-telling as opposed to the spirit of activism based on political and social opinion and emotion. So opinion and fact are interchangeably used by training journalists. They find it difficult to differentiate one from the other. So the coaches find themselves needing to remind journalists the difference between the two, and they're told to base their investigations on actual research and not on something they heard from someone in passing. And they are also taught not to rely on claims and not to expose anything without the availability of factual evidence. During the process of formulating a hypothesis, journalists struggle to grasp the idea of what a hypothesis should be doing, and that it was, and they tend to have a concrete opinion rather than a notion that needed to be researched and tested. Since learning to rely on facts continues during the investigative process, one of the other issues that coaches find is that they need to remind their training journalists the importance of continuously fact-checking their process. Now, there are also cultural factors that shape the mind and frame of an Arab journalist, and which in turn affects what kind of facts they're looking for. So even if we establish that they need to look for facts, it's teaching them what kind of facts they need to look for. I mean, one interesting example of this that rose during a training session, which I thought was very interesting, journalists were asked to work in pairs, and they were asked to conduct an exercise where each trainee would interview the person next to them and find something about them that was deemed newsworthy. So that was the requirement of the exercise. And the time, interestingly, after we heard what they said, the time was spent uncovering more descriptive information, such as whether the person they interviewed was polite or not. That's what they found. What their age was, what their marital status was, the number of their kids they had, the tribal family, the affiliation, the tribal affiliations. Now, this information is significant in Arab culture, and therefore it was obviously what journalists focused on. But this information could arguably be regarded as limited in comparison to other facts that could have been uncovered and which in turn could lead to a newsworthy story. Some training journalists are aware of the reliance on opinion rather than fact in their investigative process, where they've explained that this is due to lack of factual evidence. So when the journalists were told you have to rely on facts, they said, all right, sure, we need to rely on facts, but one of the challenges is that there is lack of factual sources, factual evidence from sources. So when they were asked what skills do you need to learn, they said we need to learn how to develop a trusting relationship with our sources, the people we interview, that is not based on bribery. We need to know how to access factual information from companies and analyze budgets, and we need to use the data, we need to know how to use the data that's been sourced. So accessing information from Arab countries is incredibly difficult for various reasons. It's problematic mainly due to the lack of archival material and restrictive of freedom of information FOI laws. Just a quick brief on FOI laws. According to UNESCO, progress on freedom of information legislation has actually been quite slow in Arab countries to other parts of the world. So Jordan passed an FOI law in 2007 that has undergone a difficult implementation. Tunisia, after the protests in 2011, they enacted a freedom of information law. Yemen also passed an FOI law in 2012. By the way, Yemen had one of the most progressive FOI laws in the region, and it was done in consultation with NGOs, international consultants, but obviously what happened is put everything to a halt. So Rana Sabah from Arij, the executive director, she says that FOI laws in Arab countries have no clear policies, they have no clear procedures, and that the policies they put in place are, and I quote, window dressing for donors. So it never really gets enacted. I have a whole chapter on my book on FOI laws, and it's really interesting. But the main thing that comes out of it is when a journalist goes and puts an FOI request to get a particular piece of information from an organization or company, there is always the responses are, this is security information, we cannot release this information. There was actually a bit of a lingering joke going around with journalists saying, there was one journalist who was doing an environmental story on cattle in Jordan and went to the Ministry of Agriculture requesting the number of cattle that were in Jordan, and the response was, this is security information. So it's just a standard response. The other issue remains that also journalists prefer getting information through traditional paths, such as buying information or from their cousin at the ministry. It's easier to get information like that. It's just what they're used to. Time delays is another thing I want to talk to you in regards to training. Investigative reporting is a form of journalism that is time-consuming due to its investigative nature, where in-depth research and fact-finding lie at the core of its process. But this is further delayed. So not only is investigative journalism an ongoing delayed process, but it becomes further difficult when the sources are not there, and there is delay. So one coach talks about one case that he supervised, an investigative story that took 1.5 years. This was an investigation that was conducted for Radio Farah al-Nas in Jordan, and it took 8 to 9 months, and it was conducted by 2 journalists. The investigation was on the use of smoking by children of 5 and 6 years of age, and the drinking of alcohol at the age of 11 and 12 at the northern Ghor region in the Jordan Valley. And because this was a rural area, there was really no monitoring of this or official control of this phenomena. So there was another issue that the alcohol and also tobacco was being smuggled. So there were various stories here. It was quite a good, strong investigative story. When they put in a request for the police to respond, the police never responded. They waited 2 months for this response and they never got it. Another story to showcase this was a story of burnt oil for traditional ovens. What was happening is they were using burnt oil that was being taken illegally from car engine oil and sold to rural bakers, who then were running their ovens using this used oil, which resulted in poisonous grey debris resembling charcoal on the bread that was baked in the ovens. So there were 2 journalists trained by Arij, went out to investigate this. They took samples of the burnt oil, took it to a laboratory that was operated by a government organization. Some reason they still don't know. Someone at the laboratory who sabotaged their efforts and just kept delaying the results and told them to come back in a week, in 2 weeks, and 3 weeks. Eventually, they never got any results. So I'm making a point that investigative journalism is a timely process. It gets further delays. In university education, I'd like to talk a little bit about that. The lack of investigative journalism education at a university level has also been problematic. However, this has been slowly addressed. Currently, there's an inclusion of investigative reporting on the increase. For example, the Faculty of Media at the University of Sana'a, in Yemen, they provide an investigative journalism unit. The Lebanese American University, the Open University in Jerusalem, and Birzeit University in Palestine. There's one in Hebron. Sabah notes that there was a university in Gaza that actually wanted to start an investigative journalism unit, but they had issues of getting access because of the closure of the borders. Jordan Yarmouk and Zarqa University. And in Tunisia, they even went a step ahead and have created a Masters of Investigative Journalism in cooperation with NYU. So it's been a successful step. However, there still are problems facing investigative journalism at universities. One of them is that academics themselves have not worked as journalists, so and they've never had an opportunity to work as journalists, so not even investigative reporting. This means that they are not really able to teach investigative journalism. One of the things that Arij did was that they introduced they created a manual for to teach the professors how to teach, with examples, and so that has been used. The Arij curriculum has been an attempt to bridge that gap. But overall, the eventual development of a culture of investigative journalism at universities will take time. The other issue is student safety. So I sat in a professors' roundtable in one of their conferences, and all these professors came in, and one professor from Lebanon said that he's just not convinced that at a university level students will actually learn to do proper investigative journalism because of the limitations imposed on them. So universities don't offer legal protection, and some academics have even said that many countries, Arab countries, university lawyers are themselves corrupt and cannot be trusted to protect students. So this places responsibility on academics to protect the students, and they are not necessarily qualified to do so. There's also the political and economic factor that is disruptive for journalism education, let alone investigative journalism education. Example of that is a Yemeni academic who voiced her concern, saying in, for example, the start of September 2014, they wanted to start the academic year, but the Houthi group came in, so that delayed them for a whole semester. And then she said there are other issues such as the lack of electricity, continuous electricity, difficult to run classes within that environment. There's also the environment is not conducive to education in general. So they say, that Yemeni professor said that the university doesn't provide good facilities for journalism university students compared to science bachelor degrees. So they prefer more the engineering, the science areas. So language is another barrier. So the use of examples on YouTube means that in English is difficult for students to understand because of high skills in the language and proficiency in the English language. Arish has been addressing this by funding not only, has been funding journalists to attend English language, especially in rural areas, but this will be quite difficult at a university level with large numbers of students. I wanted to share with you this. When in that professors' round table, we sat there for 4 hours, and professors were asked about their aims and ambitions for investigative journalism in the region, and they focused on 2 areas. The first is the need to transmit investigative reporting skills to journalism graduates. And the second aim is the development of investigative journalism into an institution that will impact society. It's interesting to see from these aims, if you look at what is being said and marry it with the country, that they all share a collective objective of needing to develop investigative journalism, but each of them is specific to the political and economic and social state of that country. I would like to talk to you also about social pressure. Before I go on to that, actually, I'll talk about practice. So that's it for training, but I'll go on to talk about practice. And I want to talk about social pressure. I went into this project thinking that the main obstacle and challenge for investigative journalism is the state, the government control in Arab countries. However, my research has found that in fact the major limitation has been society itself, the Arab society. Society has its demands and its cultural limitations, and it in turn impacts journalists and it impedes their work. And in order to discuss this challenge, I'd like to talk a little bit about understanding Arabs and who they are in relation to my work. There are a few characteristics that are found in Arab identity. By the way, I will speak critically as an Arab myself. So, the Arab identity has always had an immediate impact on the formation of the media message. Such as the uniformity of belief systems and ideologies, the dominance of anti-Western sentiment, and the Arabic language, to name a few. These have had an impact on how journalists write news stories and report. What constitutes an Arab is a highly debated topic, and given that geographically a united Arab entity was never formed, rather what exists is a collective of separate states that are situated in the same region and share a common larger history. So not only does the Arab identity play an inherent role in the formation of social attitudes, but also in terms of journalism practice, the Arab people have also collectively endured throughout history strenuous political and economic conditions that have had an impact on their beliefs, morale, and behavior. So it's problematic to consider the Arab region today without taking into account this historical sufferance, and we find that often the mediated debates, the debates that we find in news reporting surrounding current Arabic politics, are stripped from this historical context. Continuous straining conditions have recently led to the explosion of what was witnessed as the Arab Spring, and that has left the majority of the region currently in turmoil. So within such a complex, brief background, I know you know it, it's just a reminder, but within such a complex social structure and conditions that exist in each Arab country, journalists find themselves constantly aware of the social demands, limitations, and expectations. And I will bring in an example of this, which illustrates the social complexities and pressures facing investigative reporters. It's an investigative story called Jordan's Secret Shame, which was conducted in collaboration with BBC Arabic. You can actually watch it on YouTube. I tried to bring it in, but it wasn't translated, but it's there in Arabic. And it was conducted by Hanan Khandaqji. The story, you probably remember it, made international headlines. It uncovered cases of maltreatment, negligence, and daily abuse of private care homes for children with physical and mental disabilities in Jordan. And what Khandaqji did is she went undercover. She's there on the left. She went undercover while she was posing as a volunteer worker for these homes. She was documenting beatings with a hidden camera, and abuses of children that ranged from severe autism to Down syndrome. And she also documented cases of children being tied to chairs and ignored all day. So this investigation sparked noise at an international level and was aired on BBC Arabic. Initially, in response to the story, the Jordan's Minister for Social Development visited the care home, and he tried to dismiss the abuses and call them isolated cases and not a systematic problem. However, the King of Jordan ordered an inquiry the same day to be conducted within 2 weeks of airing of the investigation. The investigation was set up, the investigation committee, and within 2 weeks it submitted its final report. It revealed, I quote, additional abuses are including keeping mentally disabled children in cases, were happening at 8 private care homes, and the 8 care homes were facing allegations of abuse. 3 centers were closed down, and several caseworkers faced criminal charges. So in addition to Jordan's government, the government promised to revise policies and laws to meet international human rights standards. Now, this story, is an example A of an investigative story and how investigative journalism can be a powerful tool for change. Despite showing the shortfalls of government monitoring of children's home, it resulted in gaining the attention of the government and led to a swift action. So in this case, government control was not the issue of this investigation. In fact, accordance with how we see and define investigative journalism, this story did exactly what investigative journalism should be doing. It A, uncovered a secret, B, it informed the public, and C, resulted in actual change. So it's a perfect formula for a successful investigative journalism story. Surprisingly, the challenge faced by investigative reporter Khandaqji in this particular example was the local social criticism. So the whole world was saying, how amazing is the story? How well did the Jordanian government respond to this? She was being hailed as a fantastic investigative reporter, but her own society was being highly critical, accusing her of showing veiled Muslim workers at the homes, abusing and hitting kids, thus portraying Arab Muslims in a negative frame to an international audience. People began to accuse Arij of intentionally wanting to portray Muslims negatively since they were foreign funded and therefore did not want to benefit the country. Khandaqji had to respond to these allegations, telling the society at the time, I'm veiled myself. Sabah comments a really interesting comment in an interview I had with her, and I'll read it out for you if you don't mind. We as a society do not like to admit our failures. We do not like to analyze our shortcomings. Every time we do an investigation, society tells us you are foreign funded. You want to destroy the society, country. You want to let the laundry out, like the Hanan Khandaqji story. You did a story portraying covered women hitting kids. We or they responded saying the journalist herself is covered. What is better, to continue with abuse or worry about the portrayal of covered women? Society is harsh. Anywhere in the world, investigative journalists are not popular people. So other forms of social limitations include the challenge in getting, so this is one good example, but other examples include that during the process of doing an investigative story, people don't like to talk and provide any information and get interviewed, especially in front of a camera. So when the camera comes out, so the journalists were telling me, we speak to people and they're giving us all this information, they're actually giving us valuable information. But when we bring the camera out, they say, no, in front of the camera, I don't speak. So he adds that there is some sort of phobia from the camera, which sets some limitations to television investigations. So investigative journalists are surprised by the reaction because people don't like to appear as cases. This fear of being documented and identified, I think, comes from a tradition of historic surveillance, where citizens over the years in the region have learnt to either voice their concerns anonymously to avoid prosecution or avoid voicing them altogether. So in parts of the world where it's historically been prominent with political instability, people do not voice their opinions publicly in fear of being identified. And this is problematic for journalists in general and not just investigative reporters. It's challenging to get people to talk, and especially on a visual platform. Recent times, journalists are finding themselves becoming increasingly isolated in society. I'm still talking about the social pressures because this is one of my main findings. In light of the recent political changes brought about by the Arab Spring in parts of the Arab world, such as Syria, Egypt, and Libya, that have witnessed bloody unrest, people are deciding that democracy is not a priority in the face of safety, security, and well-being. Syrian refugees flocking from neighboring countries are a strong reminder of this. The escalation of civil wars and the rise of political unrest and the domination of extremist groups like ISIS are evidence to Arabs of the consequences that result from demanding democratic rights and calling for basic civil freedoms and liberties. So in such hostile environments, Arab societies have become increasingly critical of journalists and especially investigative reporters. At the 7th Arij conference held in Amman in December in 2015, Tim Sebastian, who's a former presenter of the BBC's program Hard Talk, recalls how one Jordanian journalist told him that society doesn't care about media freedom and that most Jordanians don't even want to hear the words freedom or reform after what happened in Syria, Yemen, Libya. To them, reformists are part of the foreign plot to destabilize the country. I'll share with you a quote that stayed with me. And again, I hope you don't mind me reading it. The chances are, this is what he was telling journalists in a large room, investigative journalists from all the Arab world. The chances are that society isn't going to give you prizes for digging out the truth, even if you succeeded in getting it published. That's what you're up against, not the governments that would seek to control your voice, but sections of the public that don't even want to hear it. I remember several years ago talking about human rights with a Cairo lawyer who began laughing at me. People aren't talking about this stuff, he said. They don't want it. At least they want other things much more. They want a job, money, medicine for the sick, and the quiet life. And if a dictator can offer them, then to hell with your free speech and your free press. Which do you think they're going to sacrifice first? So it is a lonely job you have, he told journalists. It's difficult for investigative journalism to lead to improvement if society itself does not allow it or accept it or even pushing it back. And Sabah, the director of Arish, says, society does not want to go through the painful analysis of what is wrong or right. There are so many social, religious, and cultural taboos which are present everywhere in the world but are magnified in our area. So the topic of my talk is about culture of journalism. One of the overarching challenges facing investigative journalism in the Arab region is, in fact, journalism practice on the whole, and that the traditional styles of reporting are still entrenched in Arab journalism culture. Although many parts of the developing world also suffer from these stringent forms of reporting, the Arab culture is heavily integrated within the Arab journalism culture. The Arabic language has historically been a vehicle for poetry and literary expressions, for example, where tournaments would be held in the Arabian Peninsula with the strongest poetic expressions. The Arabic language has always been seen as a tool for pride, equivalent to the sword. So the Arabic language can in turn be described as an emotive language. This, during also my PhD research, has been evident. Essentially, the effect of this emotive language, the effect of Arabic language on the cultural usage, have a few characteristics which Patai pinpoints as exaggeration, overemphasis, over-assertion, and repetition. And it's important to note that it's not only the literary component of reporting, which also exists in other journalism cultures, that's problematic, but rather that it is used heavily in literary content for emotive persuasion. And the cultural influence on news reporting is also reflected in content. There's other kind of cultural issues that affect the journalism, culture of journalism, such as difficulty to adhering to deadlines, summing up what I've said in terms of differentiating between fact and opinion. There are various cultures of journalism that have been, I'll just stop there for a moment. When I worked as a journalist in the Arab world, I also freelanced with CNN. I worked for a government state organization. And to me, working between a local organization and CNN, I always thought that CNN was the way to do things. There's one international way of reporting. Once I became an academic, I realized that this is not possible. In fact, it's not right. Investigative journalism in the Arab world needs to develop in its own culture. It shouldn't take that of other Western styles of reporting or journalism practices. So that is one of the things that I'm working on in my next project, is trying to see how an Arab investigative journalism style of reporting can develop that is specific to the region and that also actually takes into account all these issues and challenges. I remember that they've been trying to teach journalism through American cases, American examples, but it's important to realize that it needs to, for journalists to learn how to do and develop an Arab investigative culture of journalism, they actually needs to come from within and not from the outside. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.